Breaking revelations in the Blake Lively legal saga as shocking courtroom twists expose secrets no one saw coming. The judge drops a bombshell cutting off her claims, while high-profile names from Perez Hilton to Megyn Kelly get dragged into the storm, and the fallout is nothing short of explosive. The unfolding saga surrounding Blake Lively and her bitter legal confrontation with Justin Baldoni and the Wayfarer parties has taken yet another shocking turn, as recent filings, motions, and rulings have set the stage for a legal drama that feels more like a Hollywood script than a courtroom dispute. And at the very center of this firestorm stands the question of discovery deadlines, jurisdiction, and whether or not Blake can continue to frame herself as the victim of an ongoing smear campaign, even as the judge himself makes it clear that there must be limits, boundaries, and lines that cannot be crossed. The weight of this moment comes from months of filings and counterfilings where Lively demanded massive sets of documents arguing that Wayfarer had engaged in a coordinated effort to discredit her reputation. But the response from Wayfarer shook the narrative when they countered that most of what she was demanding was not only already promised, but also far beyond what was reasonable to provide, as if this courtroom chess game was not intense enough. Lively attempted to stretch the scope of discovery all the way up until the present day, which is nearly 9 months. After her original complaint was filed, her reasoning was simple yet sweeping. She claimed that the smear campaign never stopped, that every action, every public statement, every maneuver was meant to harm her standing. But the judge drew a hard line, in a stunning order that immediately changed the entire landscape of the case. Because in his ruling, he acknowledged that while some of the requested documents were indeed relevant, and Wayfarer would have to hand them over, the scope could not be infinite. And he ruled that February 18th would be the hard cutoff date. This was the date that coincided with her amended complaint. And anything after that moment, the judge said, was no longer a smear campaign, but rather simply part of ongoing, active litigation. And in that subtle but powerful distinction, the judge effectively took away one of Blake's biggest weapons by declaring that no, she cannot call every statement, every defense, and every rebuttal a continuation of harassment. Because once the lawsuit was filed, the parties have every right to defend themselves publicly and privately. And what this means is that Wayfarer is now protected from an endless fishing expedition, and Blake is left standing on shaky ground wondering how much farther she can push her narrative without hard evidence to back it up. And the language of the order was powerful because it underscored the very essence of proportionality and relevance, noting that documents become less important as they drift further away from the actual allegations in the original complaint. This was not merely a procedural note, but a sharp warning to Lively that the courtroom would not indulge the idea of a perpetual smear campaign. And in practical terms, it means that even if voices in the media or content creators speak about her today, it cannot be folded back into her claims in court. And that realization changes everything for her legal strategy, because it now undermines her justification for sweeping subpoenas aimed at media personalities, creators, and even journalists who have covered the story with their own commentary and analysis. The moment the judge set February 18th as the definitive cutoff date, it sent shockwaves not just through the courtroom, but across the broader conversation surrounding this case, because what it really meant was that Blake Lively could no longer argue that every whisper in the press or every comment on social media was part of some coordinated smear designed to destroy her reputation. Instead, the judge essentially ruled that after that point, the world had changed, and the case had entered a different phase. A phase where public commentary, press statements, and even the passionate opinions of creators were shielded as legitimate responses to active litigation. And this is where the drama deepens, because for months, Blake's legal team had pursued discovery against everyone from the corporate entities themselves to individual voices in the media, demanding access to contacts, communications, and even confidential sources in what many observers saw as a breathtakingly aggressive strategy. But when the court pulled back the curtain, it exposed the fragility of her approach, because without the ability to frame present-day commentary as part of a smear campaign, her justification for sweeping subpoenas begins to evaporate. And that brings us directly to Perez Hilton, one of the most high-profile creators caught in this storm. Perez found himself fighting tooth and nail against a subpoena that sought to compel him to produce documents and communications, and Blake's lawyers tried to argue that by filing certain motions and seeking protective orders, Perez had somehow waived his right to argue jurisdiction. But in a ruling that felt like yet another blow to Blake's strategy, the judge said no. Perez had not submitted himself to this court's jurisdiction. He had every right to protect his personal information and fight back against what he saw as overreach without suddenly being trapped in a jurisdiction where he had no proper contacts. And this ruling did more than protect Perez in the moment. It set a precedent within this specific case that the court would not allow Blake to expand its reach beyond the boundaries of fairness and due process, and the judge's language was firm. He wrote that just because someone seeks to keep personal information private or asks for a stay does not mean they are consenting to jurisdiction. Nor does the act of filing motions that argue both jurisdictional defenses and merits arguments count as a waiver, because courts recognize that litigants, especially those without legal representation like Perez, in this matter have the right to argue both fronts simultaneously. And the more the judge wrote, the clearer it became that Perez would not be forced into compliance in New York, and that the subpoena would instead have to be fought in Nevada, where Perez resides, and where Nevada's strong reporter privilege laws could very well shield him even further. And this outcome instantly raised the stakes for Blake, because if Perez is shielded in Nevada, and if other creators like Megyn Kelly and potentially Andy Signore also push back, then her entire strategy of targeting content creators may collapse under the weight of jurisdictional and constitutional protections. As the ripples from these rulings spread outward, the focus turned sharply toward the other high-profile names caught in the crossfire, because while Perez Hilton's victory in New York gave him breathing room, it also cast a spotlight on Megyn Kelly, whose name had surfaced in filings and whose reputation as a seasoned journalist made her one of the most formidable opponents Blake could possibly have chosen to target. And when Megyn publicly addressed the situation, she delivered a response that was both cutting and decisive. She reminded everyone that she had spent decades in mainstream media working at NBC and Fox News, and that her role as a journalist was beyond dispute. She made it clear that her opinions about the case were formed independently through her own careful review of documents, filings, and evidence, and that she began from a position of neutrality, only to arrive at the conclusion that Blake's narrative did not hold up under scrutiny, and Megyn stressed that she did not receive talking points from anyone. She did not rely on the influence of Brian Friedman, despite the fact that he had once been her attorney long before his involvement with Justin Baldoni, and she emphasized her sacred obligation to protect sources and to stand firm against any attempt to pierce the shield of journalistic independence. This statement sent tremors through the conversation because it highlighted how dangerous it was for Blake to attempt to paint established journalists as part of a smear machine, and it also exposed the thinness of her argument. Since if someone like Megyn Kelly could independently reach conclusions unfavorable to her case, then how many others could reasonably do the same without any outside influence? And this realization is where the suspense mounts even higher, because the legal logic begins to collapse in on itself. If Megyn is protected by the shield of the press, if Perez is protected by jurisdictional limits and Nevada's reporter privilege, if Andy Signore is still fighting his subpoena in court with arguments that mirror those already validated by the judge, then how many dominoes are left standing in Blake's campaign to extract evidence from commentators and creators? And this mounting pressure does not exist in isolation. It feeds back into the central discovery disputes with Wayfarer itself, because the judge's February 18th cutoff is not just a date on a calendar, it is a guillotine slicing through her argument. That ongoing harm is perpetual, and it forces her team to live in the uncomfortable reality that evidence past that date is no longer evidence of harassment, but simply evidence of litigation defense. And that shift is monumental because it weakens not only her motions to compel, but also her broader public relations framing of the case as an unstoppable smear campaign that never ends. And the irony is that every new ruling, every attempt to stretch her reach, only seems to tighten the leash that the court has placed upon her, leaving her with fewer arguments and fewer tools to press forward in the way she once imagined. Blake Lively finds herself standing at the edge of a cliff, both literally and metaphorically, because the battle she has chosen to fight has left her reputation battered, her alliances fractured, and her carefully curated Hollywood image in freefall. The courtroom has become more than a legal arena. It has become the stage where every whisper, every document, every private exchange is dissected under the blinding spotlight of public scrutiny, and as each revelation surfaces, from her own contradictions to the undeniable weight of testimony from those she once trusted, it becomes impossible to escape the sense that this story is spiraling beyond her control. The very people she once leaned on to uphold her narrative are the same people now whispering doubts behind closed doors, as if waiting for the inevitable collapse of a house of cards that was never built on truth to begin with in Hollywood. There is no currency more valuable than credibility, and once credibility is shattered, it cannot be bought back with money or salvaged by desperate PR spins. And Blake seems to be learning that truth the hardest way, because every motion she files, every claim she tries to assert seems only to create more smoke that draws attention to the fire burning beneath her story. Insiders say the weight of Taylor Swift's texts about her involvement in private disputes is not just damaging evidence, but a symbol of betrayal that cuts deeper than any courtroom argument, because once friendship is broken in such a public way, the audience will never forget it. And now, as Justin Baldoni remains steady in his quiet persistence and Ryan Reynolds avoids the questions that swirl around his wife, the world is asking whether this battle was ever worth it at all. Blake entered this fight as though she could bend reality itself, but reality is stubborn, and the courtroom has no patience for illusions. Her insistence that she has been wronged rings hollow against the backdrop of contradictions and shifting narratives, and the longer she tries to cling to the role of victim, the clearer it becomes that she is only tightening the ropes around her own credibility. Her silence at critical moments has been as damning as her statements at others, and the judge's rulings make it evident that her attempts to control the narrative are no match. For the raw power of evidence, the press has already turned this saga into a symbol of the dangers of unchecked ambition, warning that Blake's desperate grasp for vindication has instead opened the door to humiliation and exposure, while Justin's restraint has painted him as a man simply weathering the storm rather than provoking it. And Taylor Swift, though not on trial, finds her words weaponized as the undeniable reminder that in the end, friendships are tested not by laughter in good times, but by honesty. In hard times, every Hollywood feud has its moment of no return, the point at which the machinery of gossip, outrage, and spectacle grows too powerful to stop. And for Blake, that point has passed the whispers about her breakdowns. The stories of her fury at legal setbacks, the speculation of allies abandoning her, all create the picture of a star unraveling before the eyes of the world. And while she may still fight with lawyers, motions, and appeals, no one can fight the tide of public perception forever. The deeper question this case now raises is not whether Blake Lively will win or lose legally, but whether her career, her friendships, and her carefully polished image will survive it all. Because in Hollywood, the courtroom is only half the battle. The real trial is always in the court of public opinion, and that verdict is already being written in headlines, in whispers, and in the silence of those who used to defend her. And no matter what verdict the judge ultimately delivers, Blake has already lost something far more valuable than a case. She has lost the narrative itself. As this chapter of the Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni legal saga comes to a close, the conclusion that stands above everything is that this was never just about a courtroom dispute or a single legal claim. It was about power, influence, credibility, and the unraveling of carefully crafted Hollywood images. The courtroom became the stage, but the real drama unfolded in public, where every filing, every testimony, and every revelation was scrutinized by fans, the press, and industry insiders alike. What began as an accusation spiraled into a spectacle that drew in not only the parties involved, but also people close to them, the media, landscape, and even the larger culture around celebrity accountability. Blake Lively entered this battle with confidence, believing her star power and legal team would shield her from deeper scrutiny. Yet what ultimately emerged was a portrait of vulnerability, contradiction, and desperation. Her insistence on pushing a narrative that wavered under cross-examination, and evidence left cracks in her credibility that no amount of PR spin could completely repair. Justin Baldoni, meanwhile, transformed from defendant to resilient fighter, not only holding his ground, but gaining sympathy from both the industry and the public. His image, once overshadowed by Blake's fame, took on new weight as he positioned himself as a man willing to stand up to falsehoods and power games. The contrast between the two became symbolic: Blake fighting to preserve her dominance, and Justin representing resistance to that very dominance surrounding them. Taylor Swift, Ryan Reynolds, Hugh Jackman, and countless other names floated in and out of the narrative, whether through testimony, rumors, or media commentary, reminding everyone that Hollywood is never isolated but always interconnected. Each new piece of evidence carried ripple effects, shaking relationships and alliances across the entertainment world. The court's rulings, especially those related to the release of sensitive communications, demonstrated that even the most protected stars are not immune to the pursuit of truth. In the end, the fallout has become the real story, because win or lose in a strictly legal sense, Blake Lively walks away with her reputation battered, her trust questioned, and her legacy debated. Justin Baldoni emerges scarred, but not destroyed his resilience, now part of his story, and the industry at large has been forced to reconsider how much weight is given to star power versus evidence and integrity. This battle became a warning shot for Hollywood that even its brightest stars can fall when confronted with undeniable facts and a relentless pursuit of accountability.